Alrighty. Welcome everybody. Welcome back. And this is chapter 4 in my my advanced astrological treatise, historical treatise, if you will. And yeah, this is chapter 4 out of 6. And I may even expand further in the future. But again, here's a substantial expansion of chapter 4, the axes of authority, continuing the treaty's architecture and literary voice. This chapter treats the American presidency not as a succession of individual leaders, but as a transit receptor, an office whose occupant is magnetized by the nation's karmic needs and whose tenure reveals the state of the sovereign body. Before we get started even further, I'd appreciate if you subscribe, like, comment, and share if you dare and care, with peace and love. Alrighty. So let's talk about the axes of authority, which is the name of this chapter. And we break it down, of course, into subcategories. And our first one is government as a house of mirrors. And just for further reference, most of my videos, I'm usually drinking water. So if I take a break from speaking a lot, that's what that is. Alright, so if you see my other videos, we know we talked about the USA, and now it has a Scorpio ascendant. So if the Scorpio ascendant is the nation's wound, and the 10th house is its stage, then the presidency is the axis where wound and stage converge, the point of maximum visibility for a body politic that secretes its true operations in shadow. The American presidency has always been a paradoxical institution, at once the embodiment of the people's will and a sovereign power whose origins lie in the same colonial and slave-holding structures that the Republic was founded to transcend. In astrological terms, the presidency is the mutable point where the fixed signatures of a Sibley chart are refracted through the natal charts of individual men, and so far only men, producing a theater of authority that oscillates between the sacred and the abject. So essentially in this video, in this chapter, we're going to trace the synastry between the U.S. chart and the charts of its presidents, focusing on the transits that produce what we will call structural derangement, the moments when the office ceases to function as a mediating institution and becomes instead a mirror in which the nation is forced to see its own decomposed reflection. We will examine two archetypal cases. The first is Richard Nixon, whose presidency coincided with the first Saturn-Pluto opposition of the post-war era and inaugurated the modern politics of paranoia, and of course Donald Trump, whose tenure aligned with the Pluto return and the Saturn-Uranus square of 2020 through 2021, exposing the presidency as a house of mirrors with no interior. Between them, we will develop the concept of the failed state chart, the astrological signature of a government that has become hostile to its own citizenry, which is not normal in a lot of other countries, like, believe it or not. The executive as transit receptor. So the U.S. presidency is not a fixed astrological entity, but a function of the Sibley chart's 10th house, public reputation, and its ruler. The 10th house cusp at 5 degrees Libra, ruled by Venus placed in Gemini in the 7th house, tells us that the American concept of leadership is inherently relational. The president is defined by his relationship to enemies, the 7th house, by his capacity for communication, Gemini, and by the public's projection of harmony or conflict, Libra. So the office, in other words, is a mirror. The nation projects onto the president what it cannot tolerate in itself, and the president, if his natal chart is resonant with the nation's transits, becomes the receptacle for that projection. And anyone that's famous gets projected upon. That's just kind of a part of it. The mechanism of this reception is synastry. The comparison between the U.S. chart and the president's natal chart. So when a president's planets align with sensitive points in the U.S. chart, the ascendant, the moon, the 10th house cusp, the Pluto placement, he becomes a conduit for the national karma. His personal psychology becomes indistinguishable from the nation's collective crises, and when outer planets transit these synastric connections, the presidency undergoes a transformation. Right? It becomes either a site of temporary integration or a stage for the nation's dismemberment. So I want to talk about two transits in particular that govern these moments of structural derangement. Saturn-Pluto aspects, conjunctions, oppositions, squares, activate the presidency as an instrument of authoritarian consolidation. Right? These transits correlate with periods when the executive branch expands its power at the expense of other institutions, often in response to perceived existential threat. And Saturn-Uranus squares activate the presidency as a site of generational conflict, where an established order, Saturn, is challenged by insurgent forces, Uranus, and the president becomes the lightning rod for the clash. Now we will examine these dynamics through the two presidents whose tenures most perfectly exemplify the chaos transit. So Richard Nixon and Donald Trump. So let's start with Nixon. The paranoid Savine. What the hell? Google Docs. Alright, so Richard Nixon was born on January 9th, 1913 at 9:35 p.m. in Yorba Linda, California. His natal chart is a study in plutonic intensity. Sun in Capricorn conjunct Pluto in Gemini. Moon in Pisces opposite Saturn in Taurus, and in midheaven in Scorpio, the same sign as the U.S. ascendant. Nixon was in essence a walking synastry with the American wound. His presidency unfolded during the first Saturn-Pluto opposition of the post-war era. So the first Saturn-Pluto opposition of the post-war era, Saturn in Taurus opposite Pluto in Scorpio, which was exact during 72 through 73, which is a transit that activated both his own Pluto and the U.S. ascendant. So the Saturn-Pluto opposition, well, Saturn in Taurus and Pluto in Scorpio formed an opposition across the axes of resources, Taurus, and death transformation, Scorpio. This transit coincided with the following. The Watergate break-in, which happened in June 1972, and the subsequent cover-up, as well as the Vietnam War's final most destructive phase, the Christmas bombings of 1972, as well as the OPEC oil embargo, which happened in 73, which revealed the nation's resource vulnerability, as well as the beginning of the end of the post-war economic boom. All right. So for Nixon, the transit was a direct activation of his natal Sun-Pluto conjunction in Gemini, the secrecy, the manipulation, the paranoia, and his Moon-Saturn opposition, the emotional isolation, the sense of being besieged. The Saturn-Pluto opposition in the sky formed a T-square with his midheaven, forcing his private pathology onto the public stage. Watergate was not merely a scandal, it was a ritual exposure of the plutonic core of the American presidency. The conviction that the executive was above the law, that national security justified any crime, that the state's secrets must be protected at all costs. All right, the revelation. So Nixon's resignation in August 74, under threat of impeachment, was the first time the American presidency had been forced to confront its own shadow. The Saturn-Pluto opposition had done its work. It had revealed the imperial presidency, forged in the crucible of the Cold War, had become a rogue institution operating in secrecy and contemptuous of constitutional limits. But the revelation was partial. Nixon was pardoned by his successor, Gerald Ford, and the structures of the imperial presidency, the surveillance apparatus, the secrecy system, the doctrine of executive privilege remained largely intact. The transit had opened a wound, but the nation chose to bandage it rather than excavate it. And we still see this today, lingering around, and that's how history really works. But in astrological terms, Nixon was the scapegoat president, the figure who absorbed the Saturn-Pluto tension so that the polity could return to a semblance of normalcy. His fall was the sacrifice that temporarily discharged the transit's pressure, but because the underlying structures were not transformed, the same plutonic dynamics would return in different form half a century later. Now let's talk about Trump. And we'll use maybe red for Trump. The Hollis of Rhine. So Trump was born on June 14th, specifically 1946 at 10:54 a.m. in Queens, New York. His natal chart is by any standard in astrological singularity. Sun in Gemini, conjunct Pluto in Leo. Moon in Sag, square Jupiter in Libra, and a midheaven in Cancer. But the most significant feature for our purposes is the Sun-Pluto conjunction at 13 degrees Leo, which sits in exact opposition to the U.S. Moon at 12 degrees Aquarius. This is a synastry of absolute confrontation. Trump's core identity, which is the Sun, and his transformative power, which is Pluto, are directly opposed to the nation's emotional soul, Moon. His presidency was therefore not a deviation from the American project, but its mirror, the repressed shadow of the collective made flesh. So Trump's tenure from 2017 through 2021, it coincided with the final phase of the U.S. Pluto return, Pluto in Capricorn, in a Saturn-Uranus square in fixed signs. Unlike Nixon, who served as a scapegoat who absorbed the transit, Trump served as a conduit who magnified the transit, a Hollis of Rhine whose lack of internal coherence allowed the chaos transits to flow through him without resistance. All right, the Pluto return and the presidency. So the U.S. Pluto return, Pluto transiting its natal position in Capricorn, demands a reckoning with the nation's foundational crimes: slavery, genocide, imperial extraction, the conflation of freedom with property. A president who is himself a product of those structures, a real estate heir whose fortune was built on the racial covenants and exclusionary practices of post-war America, was a necessary receptor for this transit. Trump's Sun Pluto opposite the U.S. Moon meant that his every action would provoke a national emotional crisis. He did not cause the divisions that marked his presidency. He embodied them because the transit required that the nation's internal split be externalized into a figure who could be either loved or hated, with no middle ground. And as well, with Pluto in Aquarius now, we're going to start seeing no middle ground for a lot of different things, especially ideology. So Saturn-Uranus square, this happened in 2020 through 2021. It was a square in fixed signs, Saturn-Uranus, Saturn in Aquarius, squaring Uranus and Taurus, and it reaches its exact points in February, June, and December of 2020. This transit, as we saw in Chapter 3, governs the tension between infrastructure, Saturn-Aquarius, and material foundation, Uranus-Taurus. Under this square, the presidency became the site of a profound derealization. Saturn in Aquarius governs the social contract, Uranus and Taurus governs the body and the economy. The square produced the following. A pandemic that killed over 400,000 Americans by the end of 2020, with the president actively undermining the public health response. An economic collapse that disproportionately affected the working class, with the president claiming credit for a stock market that served the wealthy. A contested election, November 2020, in which the president refused to concede, alleging fraud without evidence, culminating in the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol. All right, let's talk about January 6th. Insurrection as a transit event. So, Jan 6, 2021, big day. It occurred with Mars in Taurus, the sign of the body, of resources, of stubbornness, exactly squaring Saturn in Aquarius, the sign of the social contract, and opposite Uranus in Taurus, the disruptor. The transits of that day, the Sun in Capricorn conjunct Pluto, Mars square Saturn, produced a perfect storm. The executive branch, the Sun, Pluto, and Capricorn, mobilized a mob, Mars and Taurus, to attack the legislative branch, Saturn in Aquarius. The attack was not a coup in the traditional sense. It was a ritual enactment of the howling of the Serine, The president had become not the head of state, but a mirror in which the state's own decomposition was reflected back at it. The revelation. Ooh, my button, getting weird fingered Charlie horses, if that's even how you say that. Like tingly fingers from sitting on my elbows. Alright. The revelation. So where Nixon's presidency revealed the imperial presidency as a rogue institution, Trump's presidency revealed a presidency as a mirror with nothing behind it. Nixon had a secret apparatus. Trump was a secret apparatus. His entire public persona, a performance of power with no institutional foundation. The Saturn-Uranus square and the Pluto return demanded that the nation confront the fact that its executive branch had become a vehicle for the projection of the collective shadow, not a mediating institution capable of governance. The insurrection was the logical endpoint. When the servine is hollow, the mob tries to fill the void. The failed state chart. The concept of the failed state in astrological terms is not a judgment of the polity's moral worth, but a description of a specific transit condition. When the U.S. 4th house, the foundation, the home, the land, and the U.S. 10th house, the leadership, the public reputation, are simultaneously activated by hard aspects from outer planets, and when the synastry between the president and the U.S. chart produces a short circuit, the flow of archetypal energy through the office becomes chaotic, destructive, and unable to sustain governance. The failed state chart is characterized by 3 astrological signatures. Pluto transiting the 2nd house of resources while squaring the ascendant. This signature, active during the entire Pluto return, indicates that the nation's economic foundation is undergoing decomposition and that the body politic is being penetrated by forces it cannot control. During the Trump presidency, this manifested as a series of crises: the tax cuts that ballooned the deficit, the trade wars that disrupted agriculture, the pandemic relief that exposed the inadequacy of the social safety net, all of which revealed that the state could no longer manage its own resource base. Saturn in Aquarius squaring Uranus and Taurus. As we have seen, this transit attacks the infrastructure, Saturn Aquarius, and the material foundation, Uranus Taurus, simultaneously. When this transit coincides with the presidency that is itself a hollow mirror, the result is a breakdown of the social contract. The state cannot protect the body, pandemic cannot secure the economy, collapse, and cannot maintain the legitimacy of its institutions, election denial. In the synastry of opposition, when the president's chart contains a direct opposition to a key point in the U.S. chart, as Trump's sun Pluto opposes the U.S. moon, the presidency ceases to be a mediating institution and becomes a battleground. The collective projects its unresolved shadow onto the president, and the president reflects that shadow back without transformation. The result is not governance, but a perpetual state of crises in which every policy debate becomes a referendum on the president's personhood. So the failed state chart does not necessarily mean the state will collapse. It means the state will cease to function as a coherent entity. It will lurch from crises to crises, institutions hollowed out, its legitimacy contested, its capacity for collective action reduced to zero. This is the condition we have occupied since the onset of the Pluto return, and it is the condition that the coming transits, Pluto in Aquarius, which is already going on but we'll see more of, opposing the U.S. ascendant from the 8th house, will either resolve or deepen. Alright, the future of the axes. As Pluto prepares to enter Aquarius, yes, it already is here, but what I mean is this transit is going until 2044, so we're probably going to see more of it come like 2028 and beyond. Then we're really going to start to see this ingress manifest. So the axis of authority faces its most profound test. So Pluto in Aquarius will oppose the U.S. ascendant from the 8th house, the house of death, debt, and shared resources, and will square the U.S. moon in Aquarius, the collective soul, from the 8th house as well. This is the transit of systemic death and transformation. It will demand that the nation confront not just the behavior of individual presidents, but the structure of the presidency itself, the imperial powers, the secrecy apparatus, the conflation of executive authority with national identity. The coming decades will likely produce presidencies that are even more extreme in their synastry with the U.S. chart. Figures who embody the nation's shadow with increasing intensity because the transit demands that the shadow be brought to consciousness. Whether this process results in transformation or dissolution depends on whether the polity can learn to see the presidency not as a mirror of its own projections, but as an institution that must be constrained, reformed, and ultimately subordinated to the collective will. Sanity, as we have argued, is off the table, but the axis of authority, the point where the nation meets its leaders, remains a site of potential revelation. If we can read the transits, if we can see the synastry between the president and the polity, we may yet navigate the chaos with our eyes open. The House of Mirrors shows us what we are. Whether we can look without shattering is the question that Pluto and Aquarius will answer. Now, this expansion has developed Chapter 4 as a cohesive exploration of the presidency as transit receptor with rigorous astrological analysis of Nixon and Trump, the concept of the failed state chart, and a forward-looking conclusion. It maintains the treaty's mature, unflinching voice and integrates the themes of previous chapters. With peace and love, I will see you in Chapter 5, Chapter 6, and then we are going to move on to some even cooler stuff that I've been working on. All right.